And despite various reforms embarked on by both current and previous administrations, with a cumulative expenditure of over $16 billion spent in revamping the sector, the Nigerian power sector still battles with the problem of securing enough investment. Stakeholders have lamented how investments still remain far below the 20 gigawatts of capacity demanded by the Vision 2020 policy, blaming the issue on inadequate and poor planning and the design of various reform programs as some of the reasons for the failure. Joining me from our Abuja studios to react to this issue is the former head of the Presidential Task Force on Power, Bekinbo Dagogo-Jack. Good morning. It's good to have you. There are still calls from various groups for a full-scale inquiry into the power sector reform implementation process from 1999 to date, with claims of over $16 billion without commensurate results. What's your view on this?
Thank you, Nii. I think, well, let's put it in perspective. The situation is that $16 billion anywhere in the world is a lot of money. And when that becomes a subject of speculation, I totally support that there should be an inquiry, a public inquiry. There are a lot of advantages to gain from such an inquiry, because it's not just about corruption or fraud. It could be about practice, bad practice. We can learn, we can improve our systems by going into an inquiry session and coming out with results. You will understand that the system was a vertically integrated monopoly for years under control of one ministerial oversight or the other. And those regimes typically lead to very bad planning, very bad budgeting. There are projects today, even in the sector, that have been abandoned for years. So when you look at $16 billion, you're talking largely as a metaphor of what has gone wrong, not necessarily as an exact figure. So I think it is a metaphor, and it's a wake-up call that we should have an inquiry, find out what issues bedevil the sector, and how we can spend that much money, even if half of that, and not get the kind of mileage that we deserve.
A wake-up call indeed. Now, Mr. Dagogo-Jack, in view of the overview you've just given, what critical power sector policy gaps did you observe in the first term of the Buhari administration?
Yeah, you know, basically the whole idea of development is progressive. And you want to achieve progress by self-review, by being honest with your limitations. Only last month, in July, there was a conference of a power engineering exhibition and conference anchored by some of the best minds in the industry. And they released a communique. There are three elements of the communique that speaks to your question. The first that they mentioned was they think it's unwieldy to have the power, works, and housing ministry all, bundled into one oversight point. They made that point. The second point was that they noticed there was some kind of rollback in the liberalization and deregulation agenda of the power sector. They would like that to be stepped on rather than stepped back. The third point I picked from their communique is that they would like a situation where there is a clear rolling plan that the rest of the country can buy into, even if it's a 5-year, a 10-year, but there must be something on the table in the public domain, what is going to happen every now and then in the sector, and everybody will have a common view of the future. And I think these three elements were missing, and I would like to tie in with them and kind of concur with the observations there. Thank you.
Very good. Now, there's argument suggesting a key reason for the current weaknesses or even failure of the power sector reform and privatization exercise is that the sector was not quite ready for the privatization process, and that achieving a full commercialization of the sector's agency before their privatization would have been a better strategy. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard that a few times, even from, I think, persons that were part and parcel of the design of the privatization agenda. I've heard the former chairman of NEC, Sam Amadi, talk about it. I will tell you from where I stand, it is not correct. It is totally wrong to argue in that direction. I will give you a few reasons for that. Just by way of background, I was a foundation member of the BPE, and it was then TCPC, and I was the deputy director in charge of commercialization. So I have enough knowledge about the tool called commercialization as a reform tool. But that argument is not sustainable for a lot of reasons, and I'll give you quite a few. Number one is that there was a lot of study before that decision to privatize was arrived at. Most of the studies, the highlights of the studies were that, number one, we were getting progressively behind the curve in terms of supply and demand margin. The population was growing at an alarming rate, and supply was degrading, not even growing. You can't have a model like that and do nothing. Number two, we also have proven capacity to pay. When you have proven capacity to pay a cost-reflective tariff, you better move to a market stage instead of talking about commercialization. Don't forget, commercialization talks about public sector management of the assets. Commercialization is still thinking of running NEPA as it then was, as a vertically integrated monopoly, with all the inefficiencies that have been known across the value chain. So, but privatization is the tool that everybody uses to create capacity, to generate investment, to drive innovation, to expand markets. You don't use commercialization. So for our population of 200 million, we could not be talking about commercialization as a tool. We should be talking about privatization. Thirdly, I can argue that we had the best scenario to come into the market because the Nigerian fundamentals as a nation, country fundamentals, were the strongest when we went to the market. You know, we had the largest GDP, we had all the arguments that people come into the country for. When the RFP and the EOIs were released for bidding, we had over 310 consortia asking to come into the market from 30 countries. For me, if that is not confidence in the market, I don't know what is. So there's a timing for everything. We could have done that 10 years before and not get as much appetite for investment. We could have done that today and not get the same level of appetite for investment. So all the studies showed that that was the right time. The fourth element was we had just under 2,300 or so megawatts of power, and then we ramped it up to about 4,500. That's what was on sale as a privatization asset, if you ask me, if you're using energy as your measurement. Now we have Mexico, Brazil, all of them, you study them, they went to privatization with about 40,000, 50,000 megawatts of electricity. You can see in terms of being able to come in and make corrections if you had a challenge under 4,000 megawatts and 40,000. So they even had a riskier model, and they still went to privatization. So none of the arguments would suggest that we should have stayed back, still talking about NEPA, when we should be in front, dealing with market issues, making corrections where necessary. So I think that argument is very defective, if you ask me.
Indeed, an interesting analysis there. So, in your view, what went wrong with the Nigerian power sector reform and privatization agenda?
Difficult question. Difficult question. Also, with the risk of people misinterpreting it, one being probably trying to be judgmental or passing, if you like, scorecards on other people. But that's not the intention. I also think it's not going to be picture perfect. I've not been in the system for a few years. I can't have all the data to make the best judgment. But just looking at as an overview of how it has progressed from the point when assets were handed over to the new owners, I see some elements that we could have done differently. Because the original design of the privatization agenda was to go in successive wavelengths of market maturity. So we started with the pre-transition stage soon after the handover. So all the elements were in learning curve, transmission, all of them were trying to learn how to play the privatization model, if you like, the market model. From pre-transition, we were supposed to migrate to the transition electricity market where all the risks are properly allocated, dimensioned, owned, and catered to. That's a slightly tighter regime than the pre-transition. But after that, we go to the medium and then the long-term stages of the market. Those are slightly more complex, highly liberalized market regimes. But in my opinion, there was not enough attention to protect the strength of the pre-market stage. Because I compare it to having, the closest comparison I have is a 4x400 relay race. And, you know, if you got the first lap wrong, you begin to struggle, and before you know what's happening, you are way behind the rest of the system. So we were not too conscious of the risks in the first lap, and we allowed the first lap to cascade into all sorts of directions, dissonance, deflections. So our eyes were taken off the ball, if you ask me. And so to that extent,
all right,
the principal failure.
Mr. Dagogo-Jack, I'm sorry, I have to cut in now because we have to go on a short break, but I'd like you to hold your thoughts on those issues because we're still going to discuss more on this when we come back. So to have you back on our Global Business Report, and earlier we were talking with Mr. Bex Dagogo-Jack. He's going to be talking about the problems and challenges in Nigeria's power sector as well. Mr. Dagogo-Jack, it's good to have you back. Now, recently, Mr. President commissioned the German firm Siemens as some sort of technical and financial partner for the development of our power sector, with clearly stated milestones of 7,000 megawatts by 2021 and 11,000 megawatts by 2023. So what are your thoughts on this?
I think it's a good, overall, it's a good development in the sector, which, if you ask me, for want of better description, is almost in the emergency ward, so to speak. So whatever emergency arrangements that can be put on board to bring us back to life will be appreciated. But more than that, we do have a lot of benefits from this intervention. Don't forget, whenever you have a brand as strong as Siemens connected with your power sector program, it signals confidence in the market. As we speak, we still have one of the most viable electricity markets in the world, demographically, all the other elements, all the other factors considered. So when Siemens is on board, you tend to signal the other players that something good is happening here. We need all the additional foreign direct investment we can mobilize because we're way behind where we should be. So I think it's a good development. We need to see the project documents. I haven't done that. We need to look at the connection between the project and the tariff regime design and the commercial relationships that will become the responsibility of those who are benefiting from the intervention. Lastly, I don't think, even from the media reports I see any kind of focus on the regulator, NEC. I believe NEC itself is deserving of some attention from this wide project program. Because if you take all the operators up and you leave NEC down, NEC, which is supposed to supervise them, regulate them, will be weakened and will not be able to do as well as it should have done. NEC can be seriously empowered technology-wise, ICT-wise, communication-wise, data processing-wise, and to begin to even energize other smaller players for benchmarking activities. We need the operators to be reported in the public space as to whether they're doing well or not. We need tools to do that accurately and not subjectively. So I think if a part of this fund can be dropped around the NEC corridor to improve their capacity to regulate, I think I would have liked that. Thank you.
Very good. Now, amid all this development, what do you think is the way forward to turn the sector around for the better?
Yeah, one man can have ideas, but the way forward is always better when all hands are on deck. I have some ideas. For me, even before I left the system, even before the onset of this administration, I've always had a clarion call that we should have. That was the time I actually made it presented in a formal Presidential Action Committee meeting that there is need to declare emergency in 3 segments of the power sector: the transmission emergency, the gas to power emergency, and the metering penetration emergency. Now, if we're able to focus on these 3 elements, the reason why a president declares emergency in those areas is to alert the system across and to get everybody prepared for focus. Even the people internally managing these projects are aware that the president has declared an emergency. There's a systemic change, and you're able to stampede, if you like, performance and get kind of leapfrog, if you like, jump to a different threshold of performance. Even the president who declared the emergency owns the declaration and is able to sign off many things, debottleneck many bureaucratic strictures here and there, and you tend to see things moving very forward. So I see the metering gap issue because I will tell you, give a simple example. 2014, right up to 2015, revenue performance by discos were hovering between 60% to 70%. Some were doing way better, Plateau, Ikeja. But by 2016, it dropped to an all-time low of under 25%. The same market, the same consumers. What went wrong? Somebody took their eyes off the ball, and some other people felt that they could get away with whatever they wanted to do to the system. And here we are struggling to even pay the discos even before you have to pay for the energy that they received. That's not a sustainable model. So metering emergency is top on the agenda. I think transmission emergency will be good. Where transmission is not that bad because it's slightly ahead of the curve in terms of what the uptake will be in distribution. So again, distribution intervention is very key. But because we privatize the distribution companies, the intervention there must be organized so there is equity. So you don't treat them as babies when they're already grown up. So there must be a model that enables you to intervene there. And some of those models are known because I think some of the distribution companies are unwieldy, too wide for the people, for the asset owners and their capacity. So these are areas in which things can happen. But my preference is for industry to come together, government, everybody to come together on the same table and try and knock out something we can all own and we can all commit to.
Indeed, very good. Now, in addition to some of the solutions you've just preferred there, why isn't Nigeria exploring alternative source of power generation on a large commercial scale? There's wind turbines, solar power. We have the climate to support this, don't you think?
Correct. We do have a lot of alternative energy sources. We do have them. I also want you to put it in context that each of them have their, if you like, cost profile and also their scale profiles. So there is a kind of scale below which you can't attract serious investment, utility scale investment into those spaces. But I think for us, the fundamental issue was that we already were configured around hydro and natural gas. And we needed to make the best of that and begin to use the others as, if you like, icing on the cake. Whereas if we get stampeded into going there, you might have technology issues. You can get into China or get somewhere to get equipment, and you don't even have the skill sets to manage those equipment. But we build skill sets for natural gas, for hydro, for as long as 50 years. If you like, those are our strength areas. So it's to optimize those areas and use the others to back up our system. That's the way I look at it, but that's my opinion, personal.
All right, very good. Now, will it be beneficial for states to generate their own energy needs based on resources within their territories to do so, thereby reducing pressure on the national grid? What's your take on that?
I totally agree with you that states ought to be in the game, ought to be in play. They have the capacity. They have a lot of the assets. They don't even need to purchase them. We're talking about land if you're doing solar. We're talking about water bodies if you're doing mini hydros. You know, they have a lot of natural resources that can be converted into energy off-grid, state grid. The problem we have is that a lot of the state governments that are part of the leadership process in the country do not see themselves as viable enough to undertake projects of this nature. There's not enough confidence in their arrangements, the way they got elected, their background, their experience, their humility to pull together a team and give them a very big vision. When Kennedy asked the Americans to go to the moon, he had no clue how to even start the engine of an aircraft. But he had a vision. So we have governors that don't vision. They say, oh, there is so much money every month in Abuja for us to pick and share. For as long as you think like that, nothing is going to happen. But you're right. The state governors, if they all did their homework, there will be enough energy for at least 20–30% of the state demand. That becomes their secure energy. And they can focus that into specific sites like industries, factories, and what have you, and be sure that those things are fully sufficient, energy sufficient, while the other people battle for grid access. You're totally right, Ni.
Very good, Mr. Dagogo-Jack. Now, if you remember, some time ago, there were suggestions on nuclear energy for some time now on power generation. Now, how realistic is this when we're yet to overcome basic problems with the current infrastructure?
I couldn't agree with you more. I will argue the same way I argued when you talked about renewables taking center stage in our energy mix model. We know very little about nuclear. We don't have skills. We don't have understanding of even how safe it could be should there be a minor accident. I won't go there, if you ask me. Why? Because we have so many other options that bring us at par to our needs. And why would we want to be like everybody else? We don't have to be like everybody else. But that we should stop researching it, I would say no. We should continue to research it. We should continue to be on the cutting edge of knowledge so far as that option is concerned. We might even do some if you like, pre-market investments, pre-production investments in terms of infrastructure. So we can get ready over time, but we don't have to jump into that space and say we are not suddenly producing electricity from nuclear. It looks far-fetched to me.
All right, briefly now on this question, I know you've mentioned this before, but how would you rate regulation of Nigeria's power sector? Has NERC lived up to its role as a regulator in ensuring directives are adhered to by stakeholders and current operators? Should it continue to act as a bailout, for operators within that sector as well?
I'm not sure I get you. I'm not familiar with NERC bailing out any operator. If anything, is the Federal Ministry of Power, the CBN, and what have you that comes into bailout. NERC actually is to regulate the market. It's also to make the market. The laws established in NERC gave it powers to be a market maker and then a market regulator. If you ask me, they are struggling with both. They're struggling with both. The reasons are varied, and I don't think all of that can be placed on their own end of the ball game. I don't think so. But basically, we are yet to have a regulator that we can use to send the right signals to investors. Part of why we continue to struggle with investments, because an investor is looking at who is the umpire, who is going to have my back in case something goes wrong. Unless that person is robust enough, visible enough.
All right, Mr. Bex Dagogo-Jack, I'd like to thank you very much for your thoughts on those issues. Always a pleasure to have you. Many thanks.